Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my September reflections. Today we're going to be taking a look at the decks I worked with throughout the month of September and talk about some of the things coming up in October. So the first two decks that I worked with in September were my Fluorescent Tarot and my Antique Anatomy Tarot. Now, while these were the two decks that I worked with in the first week of the month, I also used them throughout the month itself. And that's something that I kind of did quite a bit this month. Rather than sticking with the sort of one deck a week thing, I ended up using sort of some of my decks as weekly decks, and sometimes I just mix and match them. So the Fluorescent Tarot and this is my modified Antique Anatomy Tarot. You might not think that these two decks actually would pair really well together because they do have two totally different art styles, two totally different aesthetics. But I found that the messages between them are actually really good. I really like the way they kind of conversed with each other. I feel like the Antique Anatomy really picked up the different pops of color in the Llewellyn. And I think it just really, they worked really beautifully together. This, of course, is my modified version that I've done. I have a whole video on my channel about how I created it. I really enjoyed working with them together. Whoops. I do have to say though, as we know, like the Llewellyn is like, you know, my favorite deck, right? It's like my comfort deck. I use this deck all the time. I use it consistently every month. It's the deck that travels with me. I'm sure you're sick of seeing that on my channel. It's the deck that's my, like, the deck. While I kind of intended this to be more of an art project, I actually really love reading with it. And I really like the additional layer that the paper that I added over the top of it kind of brings. It doesn't really bring anything into the message. Like, I feel like the message is still coming through the card itself as it really would, whether you had the extra layers of the paper over it or not. It doesn't really change the message, but it does change a little bit the feel of the deck, the mood of the deck, so to speak. And I really, really like it. And I really actually enjoyed working with it. Like I said, I kind of, I have some of them over here. I kind of intended it to be more of like an art project, but I've actually found that it's a really great reader. Sometimes my cards do still stick together, but it's not like the easiest deck to work with now that I've added all this layers of paper and Mod Podge and ink and all that to the top of it, but it reads really beautifully. And I can still riffle shuffle it, though I don't, because I'm kind of afraid to like bend the cards too much, even though they do have Mod Podge over the top. Like, I'm a little afraid to just, you know, like riffle them, like bend them, but I can overhand shuffle them just fine. And so I find that working with them in that way seems to be the best. I was doing quite a few, I think 4 card readings with them, because I could kind of, hopefully this will all fit on my table, but I could kind of make this lovely little kind of, I see it as like kind of a yin-yang figure, like they kind of meld into each other, and I really like the way the messages come through that way. I think they work really beautiful for that. As I said, the Llewellyn, you know, we've seen it on my channel a million and one times because it's my one go-to deck. Grace, if you haven't seen her channel, try to remember to link it below. Grace did a video about like the one deck, and I was thinking about doing a VR to it, but I'm just going to talk about it here real quick because this is the one deck for me, like the one deck that you know inside and out, the one deck that you can picture every single card in the deck. This is the deck for me, and I'm gonna link her video below because it was a really fantastic one. I really enjoyed watching it, so definitely check it out. She talked about how having multiple tarot decks, you know, how that's affected her relationship with the tarot, and you know, she also talked about having like the one deck, and it was there one deck that you had that you knew inside and out, that you had the most intimate relationship with. And for me, that is definitely the Llewellyn. When I picture a tarot card, the first image that comes to mind is always from this deck. And so for me, it's the deck, right? It's the deck. King and King, love that. So little side note there, but just wanted to throw a mention out for that because I really did enjoy that video that she created. So the next two decks that I worked with throughout September were the Green Witch Tarot. This is the Botanical Inspirations, and these are two kind of like really old favorites. Well, I shouldn't say really old. The Green Witch is actually pretty old. The Botanical Inspirations I really haven't had for, I think maybe a year or two. But these two decks together, yeah, look at this. The Lord of Shadows and Daffodil for Rebirth and New Beginnings. Love that. I really love the way these two decks read together. I work with them quite frequently. I do also use the Hedge Witch Botanical quite frequently with this Green Witch deck, but I really do like, especially in the kind of coming into fall months, I like to use the Botanical Inspirations because it just really has that kind of fall vibe. It has that really vintagey aged look that I just really love this time of year. Well, let's face it, I love it year round, but I particularly love it this time of year. Ace of Wands with Youthful Love. The Battle Wagon with Intelligence and Mental Beauty. Beautiful. I totally forgot what I was saying. The Moon with New Start and Wisdom. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. So beautiful. Totally forgot what I was saying. Anyway, I really love these two decks. They are kind of staples in my collection. They're favorites to be sure. Six of Chalices with Eternal Memories. These two decks just really pair really beautiful together. The messages are really in sync, really cohesive. The Green Witch Tarot is one that I sometimes like forget how much I really like it. I get, I think, caught up in all the new decks, and sometimes I forget about these old favorites that just are always like coming home. They're decks that I just absolutely love. I don't struggle to read with. They are always really on point for me. They have beautiful messages, and yeah, like I said, it's like coming home to an old friend that you haven't seen in a really long time, but you just kind of pick up right where you left off. That kind of is how the Green Witch feels for me. It's one that I really, really like working with. I've had it for a very long time, but I kind of like, I tend to forget about it. It tends to get lost in the, in all the new kind of really witchy, earthy, pagan-y decks that have come into my collection and that have really come into being in the last few years, which is really, really wonderful. But sometimes I forget about these old favorites. And the Botanical Inspirations is just one that I use for like all kinds of different things. It's definitely one of my most used Oracle decks. I absolutely love the artwork. I love the messages on the cards. I love that it has a quote, it has a keyword. Just a really wonderful Oracle deck. But one of the places this deck actually shines for me is really in this little guidebook, because I absolutely love the little portion that says inspirational message. I almost always include that whole thing in my journals. So whenever I work with this deck and I pull cards, I almost always include the inspirational message in my journal and incorporate that into my reading. So speaking of decks that I've had for a while, but actually kind of feel like a new deck, are those decks that I purchased a year, 2, maybe 3 ago, and have really not gotten around to using much. And that would definitely be the case for this one. This is the Second Nature Tarot. I love this deck. I love the imagery. I think the artwork is so fun and gorgeous, and I absolutely love the colors. But it's one, again, that I kind of like, I forget I love it. I forget that I have it. And when I was kind of going through decks that, you know, trying to kind of pull out some of those old favorites that I really have been missing lately, I came across this one. I was like, I really have not worked with this one in depth yet. And I thought now is just a great time to do it. It's kind of feels like definitely feels more like a fall to me, but like an end of summer, beginning of fall. We definitely have some of that hints of that kind of blue summery energy, that turquoisey that I think definitely reminds me of, like, you know, the ocean, which makes me think of the beach, which makes me think of summer. But it definitely has a lot of those darker, kind of more fall colors. So I think it's a beautiful blend between the two seasons in terms of its color and its artwork. But it's one that I really enjoy working with. It's very much a Waite-Smith inspired deck, so it's very easy to read with. But I love all the collaging in this deck. It's so cleverly done. I really enjoy it, and there's so much little details that you could really sink into. And it's just one that I don't share often enough because I don't use often enough. So again, another really beautiful deck. I mean, look at those colors. I mean, when you do it like that, it definitely looks like a late summer, early fall deck, I think. But I don't see many people talking about this deck. I don't think it's one that gets like shown a lot, but I absolutely love it. I think the collaging is fabulously done, and it's so kind of, it's beautiful, but also a little bit weird and a little bit quirky. But I really like her interpretations, the way that this creator has collaged these different elements together. I think it's really powerful. Like, here's our 10 of Swords, or 10 of Air in this deck. I think that's gorgeous the way that it is interpreted. So yeah, a deck that I really, really enjoy working with, and one that I sometimes forget I have. So this month for my self-care readings, I did something a little bit different. I usually use a combination of tarot and oracle for my self-care readings that I do every Sunday. But this month I used the Mystical Healing reading cards all by itself because I really wanted to take the time to really dive into the goodness that is this guidebook here. And I love this artwork. Here's the beautiful backs. I think they are so beautifully rendered. And they have wonderful, wonderful artwork with wonderful imagery on them. But I tell you where this deck really shines is kind of in this guidebook. It really is about pulling the two things together, pulling the images that we see here in the artwork and the messages in the guidebook. But this month what I did is really just dive deep into the messages that I came across in the guidebook. What I keyed into for this particular deck, I've talked about this deck a couple different times on my channel now, but really what I love is the information that we get in the guidebook, and it also has some action steps, which is really wonderful, which makes this a really wonderful deck for actually self-care. It is the Mystical Healing reading card, so it is definitely a deck that is geared towards those kind of self-care messages, but it has that wonderful sort of collagey Renaissance artwork that I just absolutely love. So it's a gorgeously rendered deck, and I think it is one that is really written very well, both in terms of the guidebook, and the keywords on them are really great. And it's just one that I really enjoy working with. I am going to be doing a walkthrough of this deck at some point in the near future, so we'll be able to take a look at it more in detail then, but definitely a favorite in my collection. So for my self-care readings, I only use the Mystical Healing reading cards, and really took that time to dive deep into the messages that I found in the guidebook, and of course, you know, looking at that imagery in the cards. So a sort of spur of the moment deck that I worked with this month is the Fluorescent Tarot, and this is of course my trimmed copy. I don't know why I should like be surprised that I gravitated towards it, but this is like really one of my favorite little decks. Besides the fact that I really dislike the cardstock, I really love working with these images, and I really love the messages that I get from this deck. I think I've mentioned it a couple of times on my channel. This is a deck that I use kind of whenever I really need to get to the heart of what I'm feeling, to understand kind of where I'm at and how I'm feeling about things. It's kind of the deck that I tend to turn to whenever I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Like with me personally, like I cannot make heads or tails of my own thoughts and feelings. When I can't like see the forest for the trees, that tends to be when I turn to this deck, and it really does provide me with that that guidance and that kind of path that I need. So yeah, the Fluorescent Tarot is one that I really, really enjoy working with. I'm still holding out hope for a reprint on just some normal cardstock, but it does not keep me one bit from using this deck. So the last two decks that I want to share with you today are the Muse Tarot and the Inner Compass Oracle. So these two decks are really decks that I like to tune into for creative work. So I don't necessarily use them as a reading, so to speak, as I use them as sort of a creative springboard for kind of kickstarting my own creativity. So usually when I'm working with it for creative prompts, I'm usually doing it in a 3-card configuration. And I think it works really beautifully for this. I am going to do a more detailed deck diaries at some point on the Muse Tarot and how I work with it. And I'll probably share a little bit more how I work with the Inner Compass Oracle with it, because I tend to pair these two decks together quite frequently, because they work really well for creative journaling, for creative kickstarting, just to kind of be a springboard for your muse. I don't use the Muse Tarot as a tarot deck at all. I completely ignore the tarot associations on it, but I absolutely love this imagery. And for me, this really is a springboard for creativity. It really does act as a muse to kind of get my creative juices flowing. And so I think in that way, it's worked really beautifully for that. So that was a look at the decks I worked with throughout the month of September. There were some definite surprises and some old favorites, of course, which I love. I love when I can reconnect with some decks that I've kind of forgotten that I even had. So moving into October, let's talk about some of the things that are going to be happening both here on my channel and actually on my website. So on my channel all October, I am doing what I have been in my head, because I don't think I've actually said it in a video, but in my head what I'm calling Oracle October. So all this month I'm going to be sharing with you how I work with my Oracle decks, and specifically how I work with my Oracle decks with tarot, because that is the primary way that I use Oracle, is to pair it with my tarot. And I have a couple videos on how I go about that process, as well as a video on how I use some of my Oracle decks just on their own as well. I also have some walkthroughs of some great decks that I'm super excited to bring into my collection, and a couple of videos on some of my favorite tarot and oracle pairings that I wanted to share with you all. So that's going to be happening all this month on my channel, which I'm really excited about, and I really hope that you enjoy. So on my website, I've actually done some couple of updates and some changes that I just wanted to let you know about. I have added another batch of bags for sale in my shop, so if you've been waiting on those, they are now finally up there. I apologize for the delay, but I'm not like a professional seamstress or bag maker, so it takes me a while. I have to just basically wait till I get a batch of them done. And basically how I do my bags is that when I go to make a bag for myself, I basically just buy extra fabric and then I just make a couple of extra bags. And so basically it's one for me, one for you. So it's not something that I continually work on. It's just something that I kind of collect along the way as I'm making bags for my own decks. They are definitely all handmade. They are far from perfect, but they are definitely made with love. So I'll leave a link for my shop in the description box below if you want to go check those out. So another little change that I've added to my website is I've actually added a page for decks that I'm looking to rehome. So all throughout 2020, and I actually did a video about this earlier this year where I talked about my struggles with kind of culling my collection. And as the year has progressed, I've kind of continued along that route. And really what I've been doing now is curating my collection. So I've been working on going through my decks and really taking a long, hard look at the decks that actually support my practice and that actually resonate with how I see tarot. So a few years ago, I think it was Simon who had done a video about decks for a reason, a season, and a lifetime. And that's kind of been playing in the back of my head pretty much all year round, really more strongly toward this latter part of the year. And I've been really using that as a criteria for culling my collection, or really what I like to call it is curating my collection. So I'm not a professional tarot reader, so I don't need like a lot of decks that would appeal to a lot of different people, because I only really read for myself and occasionally friends and family. But my decks are all really just meant for me to use, and so it's important that the decks that I keep in my collection really resonate with my personal tarot practice. And so back to that reason, season, lifetime, I've really been looking at my decks because sometimes I have decks that come in for a reason or a season, meaning that I just need them for a short period of time for a particular thing that I'm working through, or maybe for a particular type of work that I'm currently doing, or something along those lines. And so they're not necessarily decks that are meant to be in my collection for a lifetime. They're just here for a reason or a season. They're here to teach me something. They're here to share something with me. And then when we've kind of completed that relationship, it's time for them to move on. And so I have a lot of decks that really do fit into that sort of category. And as I've been slowly working on curating my collection over the course of the year, I have really use that as my criteria now of looking at the decks, and are they ones that were just here for a particular reason or a particular season, or are they decks that are here for a lifetime? What I've realized, I'm constantly curating my collection, which means I bring decks in and I send decks out, and that's kind of this process that I go through where I'm bringing them in for certain reasons, or in some cases I'm bringing them in because I don't know if a deck will really work for me until I have it in my hands. And sometimes it just takes me actually getting the deck in hand and working with it before I know if it will actually resonate with me in my practice. And when that works out, great, and when it doesn't, I need to rehome it. So my whole point to this big old long ramble is that on my website, I now have a page for all the decks that I'm looking to rehome to try and streamline the process and make it easier for everybody. Hopefully, I have added them all to my website, and they're basically just, you can purchase them as you could purchase any bag or book on my website. I will leave detailed descriptions for each of them because they are all secondhand decks, right? They're all my decks that I'm rehoming. I think I may have one or two that's actually new. Other than that, they're all used. Many of them are modified, so I will be sure to leave descriptions about that as well. Many of them don't have boxes anymore because I don't keep my boxes for the most part, so they're in handmade bags. So that's a new feature on my website. I will probably leave that up through the end of the year because I have a feeling that I will be adding to it here and there along the way, just whenever I've decided that I'm wanting to rehome a deck, and I'll add it to that page on my website. And that way everybody can just browse, and like it, hopefully it will streamline the process for everybody, and we won't have that, you know, where we're waiting to email back and forth to each other. So we're gonna give it a try and see how it works. Maybe it'll be great, maybe it'll totally bomb and we'll have to go back to the old way of just emailing back and forth. But I have high hopes that it can just be a thing that I leave up, because I do have a lot of decks that only come in for a certain reason or season for things that, you know, I'm currently working on. So we do our work together, and then I'm ready for them to move on to a new home so that I can bring something else in to work with. I've just come to the terms of that's how my tarot practice works. That's just how I do. And so rather than fighting it, I'm just like, I'm gonna embrace it. And I'm going to bring the decks in, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. And then when I'm ready to rehome them, I'm going to rehome them, and I'm not going to feel bad about that either. So hopefully this will be a good experience for everybody. If you have any questions about any of it, feel free to leave it in the comments below, or just send me an email. My email is also on my website. It might be on my YouTube channel somewhere as well. But anyway, I think that's it for me today. To be perfectly honest, I've recorded this little end segment like 5 times. So I've decided short and sweet is probably the best. So I hope that you had a wonderful September, and I wish you many blessings moving into October. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.